Hola, buenas noches, compañeros, compañeras, ¿cómo están? Bienvenidos, bienvenidas una vez más a
Welcome once more to our virtual seminar, Bolivar versus Monroe. And you see that we've had it in our ALBA Movimientos YouTube channel and also in the International People's Assembly every Thursday of this month and in the first month of July to have this seminar that we continue to promote from the schools of ALBA movements, where we have seen many of our comrades from the region, especially those from the Simon Bolivar Institute, who have also led us. And they've also led the rounds of this battle between Bolivar and Monroe against imperialism. And we have also been advancing with our themes with many of our comrades in the past rounds. And now we're going to talk about our fourth round, which is Emancipation versus Domination, the social project. So, on that note, let us continue with our comrades, with our analysis and our classes. And today, we're going to have the comrades from the Simon Bolivar Institute, Carmen, and also from Guillermo and Carlos, who have been with us in all of these rounds. And also we're going to have a Colombian comrade, Christian Barona, who's in the Buenos Aires University. And he's a specialist in geopolitical matters, and he's also a social militant in the patriotic front. So we're going to begin with our another round, and once again, welcome. So for everyone who's joining us on YouTube and IPA, let us begin. And I just want to make two comments from ALBA social movements that are very important today. First, from our articulation, from our group, I want to say a great that we're in great solidarity with our comrades who are in Jujuy in Argentina, who are resisting against the constitutional reforms from their Jujuy province in Argentina. And we demand that they respect the rights of the people, which is more important. And they have to respect all of the rights of all of these persons. And we support them from all of our movements of Latin America and the Caribbean. And so we stand with all of our brothers in Jujuy who should have their victory. And we continue with our American force against this illegitimate reforms. So we, of course, be on the front with this great movement. And so we send a great salute to these comrades of Jujuy. And we also want to recognize those comrades that are in the United States today from various brigades who were arrested after trying to speak quietly with Bob Mendes, who was saying that they should, at this point, remove Cuba from the list of terrorist states. So it's nothing more than our revolutionary and passive Cuba. And so these North Americans who just went to speak to them peacefully, they were then detained. And they were just trying to converse. So we want to begin with our round, with our fourth round today, with those two comments, and of course demanding that they remove Cuba from this list. And also to support with all of our support, all the people of Jujuy. So now that I said those two things, we can begin. So let us begin our fourth round with our comrades from the Simon Bolivar Institute. Today we have Carmen and Carlos in the video, and let us begin with the video. So for everyone who doesn't speak Spanish, we do have English interpretation in the International People's Assembly YouTube channel. So we thank you very much to all of the interpreters. So thank you to Candace and Andreina, who are leading us today with this fourth round in interpretation. So now we go straight to our video of our comrades from the Simon Bolivar Institute on our fourth round. First a big part of the legacy of Bolivar was this idea of democracy, that this colony has always been within our continent, has always been one that needed democracy, even though there are many things that were failing within this image and the first constitution that was done in this whole structure of power. They were thinking of white owners. So that left a lot of the people outside and without the ability to have any effect on their destiny, which is in direct contrast to the Bolivarian project. And so this project that we have today, which a lot of the social movements, political movements are defending today, the Bolivarian movement, they are talking about this profound democratic spirit. So our faith is much more in the people than in any government. Nothing should happen within the government without anything first happening amongst the people. So these are things that you would have seen in terms of the French Revolution and things that we look at as references. We know that the revolutionary transformation of our Americas, education had to be with the politics. They must have education and training relations, democratic relations within the communities. So Bolivar thought that was extremely important. In addition to this democracy, not just the debates and discussions, but there also must be this representation of the liberation of the people. I don't know anything better than to give the people back their freedom and their sovereignty, and this is very important. All of these revolutions that were happening in the ends of the 20th and 21st century, there was this need to transform the democratic processes that existed, that weren't like the United States, but to change the processes to do something that's more emancipatory. And that's what we had in Venezuela. And with all of the constituent processes we had, and also in Bolivia and in Ecuador, you would say that it's not legitimate. And I don't understand what crime that was committed. At the source of the law, when you can think that there are things that only the people can know. And I think it would be necessary to overlook the law because it's extremely important, because we need a democratic republic. And this is the Bolivarian spirit. So we can see that he's projecting this spirit within all of our continents, this idea of democracy. This process that needs to happen in the original colonies. So now you're having this new order of things that's happening. The Bolivarian spirit has always been criticized for being more centralized, as if he was proposing himself when he was trying to look at democracy, and that is his great legacy, and it's very important for social transformation.
To talk a little bit about what you're saying and that Bolivar talks about in the Angostura speech, and is a topic that we are remarking now. Bolivar states that the most perfect system is the one that is capable of having the biggest sum of joy for the people. And that Bolivar said that, and I think it's the contribution that expressed the better the Bolivarian project, but we cannot see this project without context. We have to know that Bolivar, Mantuano's man, was also a human being that was ahead of his own era, but he also was in contradiction with who with those who he was fighting against, and that was evident in the slavery era. We in the 1820, we can see a Bolivar saying that in the Congress, saying that if you are capable to revoke all that I am saying, you can do it. But I ask you specifically not to revoke the slavery abolition. So I think that in that moment, Bolivar manifests all his greatness, because in that moment, it was very important not to forget a project that maybe wasn't beneficial for him because he hasn't the support of society. So he insisted that wasn't the first and the last time he talked about that. Bolivar resembles with the commanders of the independence process in Haiti in 1815, when they defeated the Second Republic through a process, an inter-Venezuela process where most of the slaves, Creoles and Browns and indigenous, didn't support the independent process because they didn't identify with the movement, or maybe because they didn't understand what in that moment. But then Bolivar returned to Venezuela with Mariño and the other leaders. He returns with three pillars: man, weapons, and ideas. And those weapons, men, and ideas made Bolivar in 1816 declares the slavery abolition, and that was the first clear action in the slavery declaration. However, this process was conditioned, and we have to remember that the independence war in Venezuela in 1815 and 16 was a process mostly and exclusively for those who were in Venezuela, which means that there weren't the representatives of the Crown Army. So the Creoles were the one who opposed to the independence declaration. So we have to also mention that in 1810, the castes were distributed in the country, and that distribution talked about the pyramid of our society, who were conformed in the base by 500,000 Browns, 200,000 Creoles, 160,000 indigenous, and 48,000 free African descendants, which means that most of the Venezuelan population wasn't or didn't identify with those who were declaring independency, who didn't consider maybe the necessity of those populations. Because at the beginning, they were vindicating the rights of Fernando, as we already mentioned in the last round. So Bolivar understand that to defeat or to win the Venezuelan independence, he needs to have in favor part of the population. So part of this population was convoked or summoned by Bolivar in two ways. One way was inviting them to be part of the independence process, and the other way was virtually changing the situation or condition of slavery by independence or freedom. And then Bolivar gets out of Carúpano after the first declaration of the slavery abolition and arrives to Ocumare de la Costa in 1816. And after some years, we have a new declaration of slavery independence by Bolivar, and then he abolished any conditions. So we are seeing that Bolivar has a process and evolution of his own consideration of slavery, and this is not merely a pragmatic thing. As we know, Bolivar is a son of illustration. Bolivar understand long ago that is not natural, the slavery situation. And there's a quote very important of him when he claims to the court that he wants to say that slaves had already more rights to choose who they want to be. And that conscience of slavery is a seed that is permanent, but he's not alienated to his own political context. So he is within a process when he returns to Venezuela as a chief of commandment in Venezuela and in the independence process, but he didn't return with the historical project of hegemony, which means that he's going to face all the contradiction with the other commanders and chief of territories that joined circumstantially to defeat the process of the crown, but not to endorse the historical project of Bolivar. I think it is very important to all of us to remark in this speech before the Angostura Congress that englobes all that means for us the great Bolivarian doctrine. So I want to read it to give you the stamp of what it meant, not only the fact that Bolivar asked the slavery abolition, but also how he was influenced by the most important revolution for our continent, which is our continent independency from the crown, but also from the ideas, which means for us the support to Bolivar, without forgetting that they also support Miranda. And that was what makes us achieve a republic that consider peoples as equals in human condition, and the necessity to declare that slavery is not a natural situation for men and or men and women. So we want to also vindicate in this moment the meaning of the Haitian Revolution. And I want to close my intervention in this moment regarding the meaning of Bolivar in slavery abolition in our continent with his words before the Congress. I implored the protection of the God of humanity, and then redemption dissipated the storms. Slavery broke its chains, and Venezuela has been surrounded by new children, grateful children who have turned the instruments of their captivity into weapons of freedom. Yes, those who were once slaves are now free. Those who were once enemies of a stepmother are now defenders of a homeland. Let justice show you the necessity and the benefit of this measure. It is superfluous when you know the history of Lotus and Spartacus and Haiti, when you know that one cannot be free and slave at the same time, but by violating the natural laws, the political laws, and the civil laws. I leave to your sovereign decision the reform or revocation of all my statutes and decrees, but I implore the confirmation of the absolute liberty of slaves as I would implore my life and the life of the Republic.
Ese gran espíritu libertario de Bolívar, además, entra en contradicción precisamente con el espíritu monroísta, ya que si bien
confronts this Monroe's approach. And you see the United States developing with some sort of obligation of slavery as an institution. And you see capitalism was advancing. And we saw that this slavery was necessary in order for them to advance, which is more important in the South than in the North, when they look at maritime commerce, etc. And in the North, it was so fundamental to maintain slavery. And that's why one of the great fears of the United States with regards to these revolutions in these countries is that there could be some sort of contagion, that the relation of the South could affect what's happening in the North. When we look at these previous principles of about 20 years ago, when you look at the Monroe Declaration, they were talking about the importance, the strategic importance of places such as Cuba, and they had this expansionist view. When you look at the agrarian program, and when Bolivar put forward this idea of Pan-American Revolution in 1826 as one of the main forms, the freedom of Puerto Rico and Cuba, the United States they really reacted because Bolivar didn't even want the United States to be there. But Colombia is the one who sent the invitation. And so Henry, the Secretary of State, he had his diplomats where they were saying that they had to threaten, even if necessary, to do whatever to ensure that this idea of liberating Cuba or Puerto Rico or any other colony, to ensure that that never happens. And why? Because automatically these liberated states will ensure that they incorporated within these new republics. And they wanted to prevent a revolution such as the Haitian case, because they had this social composition, as we know. As Carmen mentioned, when we think of these enslaved persons, they couldn't be more than the rest of the population. And so it was a great point when we think of the whole Monroe attitude, whereas Bolivar was thinking in terms of in this last struggle with this, the independence of Venezuela. And Bolivar wrote that everybody else, as Carmen said, you can change everything else, but as having won this Carabobo bottle, you have to free the slaves. And that now brings us to the last aspect of these policies and the vision, the social vision of the great liberator of the enslaved persons. They had to be accompanied with this whole process of education. And one of the pillars had to be education. It's a fundamental pillar for independence in order to continue with the construction of the republic. Just to give an idea, and to contrast what came after, and he was saying that this whole revolutionary project of independence had to guarantee education. And with its education, it had to happen in a political space. Whereas they were looking at repression for the rest of people, whereas he's looking at education. So when we hear his words and he talks about the fervent need to include this, we can see we cannot have a great citizen who forgets that his family belongs more to his family as opposed to himself. Then he's miseducating his own family. So we can see the importance of education. And also he says that education is instructive for general happiness and for the freedom of all the peoples. So we can see how his focus here. And this Bolivarian thought of freedom is very linked to education. Especially when we talk about this whole agrarian reforms. And just to close, when we talk about this vision of education that Bolivar had, he also had an inclusive vision. And he said you also should ensure that children are educated in all places of society. Many people were excluded. And he said wherever you admit children of any class and of any department so that they can receive an education. This was his vision, the vision of Bolivar, to integrate, to remove slavery, and to use education to guide and to orient us to social transformation that was very important to ensure independence, which was never the independence project prior. They were only discussing amongst the leaders themselves. So you have the leaders of the colonies and the leaders that were placed. But when there was Bolivar, there was always this idea of social transformation. Thank you.
Bueno, compañeros, compañeras, muchas gracias. Primero, por supuesto, a Carmen y a Carlos por haber preparado
So thank you, comrades. Of course, thank you to Carmen and Carlos. And we want to talk about this, his project, how it was transversal. And of course, there was this great interest in this revolutionary process that's happening all across our continent, and even in the Haitian continent.
Well, comrades, if you are okay with this, we're going to give the floor to our comrade Christian Arias. As I said, Christian is a teacher in Buenos Aires University. He is specialized in topics of defense and geopolitics and is a militant of the patriotic march in Colombia. So we asked Christian to give some of his reflections to understand better this social project, Bolivarian social projects. And we also remind you that you can use the question and answer box if you want to ask something. So I give the floor to Christian, so you can open your mic. You can say you're okay. Hi, Laura. Thank you very much. Can you listen to me? Yes. Yes. Very good. Good afternoon, good night for those who are listening to us in this round proposed by ALBA movements in collaboration with the International People's Assembly and with the Tricontinental Institute and the important participation of the Simon Bolivar Institution. I think is very important, this initiative in our times, especially in a year when we are honoring 2 centuries of a doctrine that has left a legacy that is one of the instruments of domination of the American imperialism. And it is important in our region. And they proposed to me in the first challenge that appeared to me in this subject is trying to separate the subject of domination and to remark our emancipation strategy, because we are very used to have very detailed analysis of how imperialism dominated us and what's the great strategy of domination, to the point that we are seeing a sort of great enemy that is almost impossible to defeat by peoples, an almighty enemy. So I think it's important to recover or to retake, as we saw in the last rounds, that it is possible to defeat and to have a different strategy to overcome this enemy. And I think the most important concept to talk about this is emancipation. I would like to start in this case with a sentence of José Julián Martí, one of our great heroes of our America, who said that Bolivar didn't do because Bolivar has to still to do in America. And Martí said that in the late 19th century, where Bolivar was a great leader known by his liberation actions with liberation campaigns of our peoples, and who also defeated European colonialism. And even though this process wasn't concluded, so we have to think that this vision of unity in our America and also of proper liberation was in that Bolivarian thought that we have recovered in the last long 2 centuries of fightings. And I think there is something very important in the first part of this intervention and in this session, is the Congress and the idea of a great homeland, because we can think about an integration and the possibility of having an unity to reinforce the actions in this project. And thus, that counters an submitted organization that was imposed by the Monroe Doctrine as a response, immediate response to that Bolivarian project very early, when Bolivar tried to have this continental integration. Monroe and John Quincy Adams attacked with this very famous speech that becomes an international American policy to protect and conduct the destiny of our peoples. And I think that the moment in which Martí talks about this has a lot of vitality to recover all this proposal. The idea of a synthesis in Martí of an ideological emancipation and humanistic idea, and also anti-imperialistic idea, makes him a key role for our cultures in our America. They were part of a modern movement that joined humanism and anti-imperialism with a great influence in our own thoughts as America, to give birth to the university reform in Argentina, and that is going to expand to the rest of the continent, where we can see a sort of Marxism, humanistic Marxism, a first approach to what is going to be a own fight and a revolution in our continent. And I think this is going to connect or disconnected all our ideological thoughts in our continent. And Robert Dario questioned very frontly imperialism with this chorale of Theodore Roosevelt and the idea of this renewal of the Monroe Doctrine, the doctrine that tried to impose the military boot over the Caribbean peoples. And from that moment, we had a lot of response against this imperialism that were very vital to our peoples. I am thinking about, for example, the fight of Sandino and Farabundo Martí. And I think that in that moment, in those first steps in the 20th century, we can achieve the synthesis of these great ideas of an anti-imperialism with an emancipatory project and a social project. And I think they weren't wrong when when he said that why he was an anti-imperialist, with a response that debates in that moment. She said that we are anti-imperialistic because we are socialist, and because before the capitalists, we imposed a project that searched the greatest amount of happiness for our peoples. So I think we can see in our projects of fights, in our agenda of work, in our continent, an horizon and a strategic horizon that is very clear in the 20th century, and that maybe in the last decades or years in that century has a new birth in the 21st century. So I want to talk about 3 dimensions very quickly, and at the end I want to leave 3 challenges for a debate. These 3 dimensions of emancipation, I would say that there's a starting point that is very important that proposed, that a Argentinian philosopher proposed, that was exiled in Venezuela when he could study with Simon Rodriguez, a teacher of Simon Bolivar, and maybe he gives the first ideas of emancipation for Bolivar. And he wrote a very long essay about emancipation, Simon Rodriguez, The Triumph of a Failure. And this book has a very interesting thesis, which is that the liberator project of Bolivar, in a political point of view and colonialism, achieved success, but didn't consolidate the possibility of remaining or not defeating the domestic forces from the white Creoles that opposed to the slaves' liberation, which means that slavery cannot be abolished by Bolivar, precisely because the Creole oligarchy looked for the change of commandment, and they didn't want to lose their privilege. So the humanistic project was defeated by these ideological pursuits. So this idea gives us the proposal of recovering this force of the Liberator project, but also recover the project of the strategic vision to overcome these challenges, for having a project that give force to these new relationships that emerge in the emancipation processes. So I think that in the recovering of this and the progress in this philosopher gives us the consideration of education for conscience, the idea of have a criticism of life and a critical point of view of the world. And after that, we can achieve the emancipation project. And this would be a more philosophical dimension that we can connect with this declaration or conception of emancipation that already Marx proposed with this discussion of the Jewish question. It's not only about the liberties of a group or the Christians and Jewish, but about the emancipation of the humanity, to break those change and alienation forms and exploitation forms imposed in the modern capitalist society. And I want to connect this with a second moment or a second dimension, because I think there's a dimension where the subject and revolution connects. And after the Cuban Revolution, we are going to see a very creative moment that is very important for our continent, because the example of the revolutionary victory is going to give sense of a set of political economical reflections, and is going to gather or concentrate the debate, focus the debate to a more consolidated projects. So the emancipation is going to be conducted in this strategic socialist project. Maybe Che Guevara, who we honored some days ago, is one of the highest expression of this critical thinking and emancipatory thinking, not only seen as a fighter and a guerrilla hero, but also as a thinker and an individual that cares about the overcoming of the challenges in this process of transition to socialism. So we have a very great lesson to try to see the unity between the overcoming poverty and overcoming alienation. Is not only a system of distribution of richness, but also a conscious of a new humanity that thinks also in this modernist movements at the beginning of the century, the moment of Martí and Ponce. And I think is from that point of view that we can conceive this proposal of the Che, and that takes a very important role in the process of the debate in the decades in the 60s in Cuba, and that is going to encourage the creation of new critical theories in Latin America. And I want to also mention that the independence theory is part of this constellation of new ideas that search or that look that want to give a critical sense to counter the domination theory that made us give the same steps of our dominators. But maybe after that, the Che, with their own flags and slogans, and different leaders could consolidate a very important theory that having an authenticity in our own continent that is still current in our continent, and how our people suffer those domination forms and dependency forms, but at the same time they can show in front of the processes of for example, the Cuban Revolution, the possibility of breaking these forms of dependency. So in the 60s, in the 80s, we had a theoretical crisis, and I propose that as an hypothesis, as a possible failure of the strategies and forms of political fighting, but not a theoretical failure. So this is why we lived a new birth of a theory that adjusts to our historical times. So this crisis maybe was part of think related to some thoughts of different personalities. But certainly in that moment, the Cuba Revolution was very important, and other roles, key roles that gave an example. And always in those examples, we could see a synthesis of the socialist project, the traditional socialist project, and the Bolivarian project with a very authentic stamp to that emancipation project. And I want to connect this with the third dimension, where I can see Bolivarian socialism as a strategic project. And with this horizon, strategic horizon, Bolivarian horizon that emerges from in this century, that wants to recover all that was spent in to create a great homeland and to achieve the culture of our America that has maybe as a principal leader, the commander Hugo Chavez Frias, who was the power of unity and that reinforce these ideas and gives force to a process, a very important social process in our continent. And the fact that he didn't want to expand capitalism in our continent. Not only that, but also to reject that kind of accumulation of richness as an important fight, and also to prone and encourage the production of a critical thought. Maybe the most important lesson in this is not to stay in the old failures and the process of development of the great powers that was just reproducing the domination logic. So I think that we have achieved to updating this project of emancipatory revolution. And an example of this is, for example, the existence of movements such as the ALBA movement. And I think that after that, we can talk again about unity and great homeland, and after more than a decade, we can talk about the fighting against hegemony and socialism as an alternative, and we cannot lose that right now, because that's where we have the main challenges in our times. We cannot lose emancipatory horizon. We cannot lose the possibility of overcome capitalism, and this is very important. Maybe this is why we have to face the necessity of progress in this strategic framework of democracy, where we can use those mechanisms with different political systems and mechanisms to undermine emancipation processes.
Because a form of telling them that they're democratic when it's simply just a space and moments of elections. And to break down all of the participatory processes. And that's a great moment that we need to recuperate. So within these 200 years, we have to look at the ways in which we have these political processes in order to guarantee our independence, our sovereignty, and the possibility of autonomy of our people. And I also think it's a second challenge to widen this critical thinking, critical thought, to confront this neoliberalism, this mercantilization in terms of our rights, and always violating our interests. It's very important to recuperate leadership and initiatives in order to break down these ideas. Maybe it's something that we say a lot, but it's a sort of a threat when you hear these fascist ideas coming forward. And we need to have great clarity in terms of how we move forward, because sometimes they take our ideas. And we need to be able to give hope to new generations, to have a common feeling amongst all of us. And another thing that we are fighting for And one of the things that our great liberator gave his life for is to unite forces amongst our popular movements. Never get weary of the forces that are active today and to find new ways to unite us and to dialogue amongst ourselves and to create debates along these lines to construct and recuperate this emancipatory process, things that can unite us in this process for the future. And so I'm going to close on that. I left a lot of interesting elements to discuss. And I'm going to try to avoid, as I said in the beginning, to just repeat this whole idea of domination, but I think it's important to go over a little bit for the discussion. So I'm here for the questions. Thank you very much. So thank you so very much, Christian. And now we are having a lot of exchange, and there's so many topics that they put forward on intervention. And we also see, we're also putting forward some titles. And one of the things that we are missing is this ideological process. And so we have our audiences already attentive for the next round. And I just want to take advantage that we have Carlos and Carmen here with us. And there's some questions that we received in the chat. So it's only 3 questions, and I'm going to read them. And so we're going to have Carlos and Carmen, and then we'll have Christian, and then we can come to a close. So the first question is, taking into consideration that this domination has been changing, how can we adapt to ensure emancipation? And how we as people can retake our forces to ensure that we have regional integration, for example, leverage the the Congress of Angostura. And also the third question is, when we look at the new strategies of domination, what is the relation between imperialist domination and the military agreements of the armed forces of the United States with our countries? For example, when we look at Colombia and NATO, and even in the Amazon region, when we look at what happened with Brazil, Bolivia, and Peru. So, Carlos and Carmen, you have the floor. So, hi, everyone. I think that currently, in our reality today, all of these mechanisms of domination, they're changing, and it's very important that we are creating tools to strengthen our struggle within our own spaces, within our own political educations amongst the International People's Assembly, the other movements. I think the same unity amongst all of these social movements, it's the unity, the discussion is very important. It's extremely important in order to maintain our narrative and our responses. And this consciousness of the people is what has allowed us to have success in the last few years. And it has also led to great transformations. When we look at governments, even with all of the limitations that they have, the traditional limitations, they've still been able to put forward actions that would reivindicate our process. And in these spaces of integration and unity, regional unity, that maybe we're there for a long time and we weren't even talking about it. and this idea that there's only one doctrine, there's only one way of doing things, which is the general attitude that Washington has towards us. So I think that's what it's about, to continue fighting, to continue together over all of these governments, work with the governments who have more sensitivities, those that are more progressive. And it's very important to continue putting these things forward and to continue supporting them. It's very important that there not be. What we want is that we must maintain that connection between the bases and the governments so that they can resist what's happening from the outside. And we need to know it's very important that in the political field, it's been very difficult during the transformations. And sometimes we forget the contrary is a complete submission to the plan of the United States. So we have to fight within ourselves a little bit so that we could continue having this profound transformation. So when you look at the military question, what I wanted to say is it has always been a great problem for our region, the influence and the method that the United States uses. When we look at the influence that they've had, they've always been very present. Even in the plays and the interactions that we have between ourselves. In Venezuela, just so that you have an idea, in the training in itself, amongst our own army, there are always ideas that maybe there's an invasion from Brazil or a war with Colombia. And we create this scenario in order to generate this idea of our enemy is, it could be always be our neighbors and not just those that are trying to, not only those that are trying to steal our resources. So this influence, we also need to maintain our consciousness and we need to come closer and be more patriotic, not be nationalist, not chauvinist. But when we talk about patriotism, we're talking about the wider homeland. So when we think about the South American, we think of UNASUR. We need to go back to these things. It's very important. It's a step so that we can continue discussing, even in the military field, in order to face all of these natural disasters and to help the others to construct this whole process. So for all these 200 years, and it's something that we need to reconstruct what we would have had before. I just want to say, sometimes it's not just a scenario, but sometimes we have actually been defending ourselves against them. But there's also a military doctrine and an effort to separate our countries. So I just want to reinforce I think Bolivar didn't have a people that was confronting the attempts of the imperialists in itself. But what we can say is one government and a people that were not yet part of part of the society. They were just working to create organizations. So I think that in this moment, we can say that it's not as strong as it was before. Now that we have governments that are a lot clearer, you can say that we have popular organizations that are way more defined. We have a project, we have strong intentions in terms of our own fate. So I think that it's a different circumstance where we can talk about what is missing. We don't know exactly what's missing in the recipe, but we know but that these historic processes, as well as the initiatives of our independence, such as in the last decade, we know that that's where we are. So we need to continue studying it and to do the events like we're doing right now. And I think that to continue widening the struggle, I think that we still need to work on that in order to reach everyone that should really be involved, even in this movement, understanding this emancipatory process and the Bolivarian project. And we are always attacked because it's putting this imperial logic at risk. Because we know that's where the Monroe Doctrine came out of. So that's basically the trajectory and our route. We're in the heat, we're under direct fire, but that's what is happening in order for us to maintain this position. When I look at the UNASUR, it was something that was overthrown. And we can say that it's a temporary thing. And it was significant because within the Bolivarian project, there was always a popular project for our entire region, the defense, the education. There was also a geopolitical stance where the Bolivarian project put forward itself as a different sort of life. So we need to understand that what was put forward in our region is a model, a economic, social, and political model where we have different positions, and we need to continue developing and looking at all of the different elements. And we need to continue uniting ourselves from our governments as they are. Only to add this. Excellent, Carmen. Thank you so very much for these responses. Christian? So first of all, I think that our strategy should include a sort of bilateral strategy. On the one hand, when we look at all the state links, demands, and agenda with regards to specifically around progressive governments. And on the other end, a strategy from the people. So one that's more popular. And within these states, I think that they have some limitations. For about a decade, they've had a lot of strong attacks. There were a lot of offensives where they were attacking this great constructions. They attacked Chavez, they attacked Fidel. So we need to recognize that this is somewhat of a failure. And I see it as some sort of difficulty to reconstruct this process and maybe to imprint a greater radical approach from the states. Because these governments are coming from a scheme of alliance among the states. And of course, there's some particularities. Sometimes they don't even have a majority in the parliament. And so they have to maintain a lot of, engage in a lot of compromises within this capitalist, this global capitalist environment. All of this is happening in our region. However, we have to recognize in the last few years, it has been extremely clear for the reconstruction of this project within our continent. So let us put that in perspective, a sort of cooperation amongst the states who have to recuperate this whole attempt at integration and not abandon, and to continue insisting and demanding that the other governments maintain it. But the people, we can demand more. We can try to reconstruct amongst through debates. And when we look at our common points, we can have a Bolivarian project. So maybe in the rest of our region, we can have some sort of responsibility, not just alliances, but the people also have to recuperate this project. And I think it's very important to bring forward this Bolivarian project and to create an agenda through dialogue. And we need to assume as a collective within ALBA's Movimientos and try to expand on this dialogue. Is over a decade ago, we've had a sort of strong, consistent emotion towards this liberating feeling. So maybe we've dropped a little bit, but I think that we need to have a strategic horizon. And these are some of the forms of liberation, because we have ideas. Maybe some are diverse at this point, but we can bring them together. So with regards to the imperialist domination, I'm gonna try to be quite systematic on this point, because I lost a few of the points, but I think the structure of domination, specifically the military domination, it's to have this economic position, to have this complete power, and this inter-American system that's been there for years. And with this logic of anti-communism. And it's really to not create to not promote this ideology. So when we look at all of these moments that would have happened, they always look at having some sort of cultural penetration. And also when we look at the narratives that happen, and we have seen how the United States, they promoted, where they have favored certain processes within our within our regions. And all of that is part of this whole machinery of domination. And so this strategy it's quite specialized in the United States, their strategy. So they're always attacking those processes that are more progressive and democratic. They have a whole structure. In order to provide arms, to give them a sort of privilege, to create a whole narrative so that we as a region, we can have a space where we can have autonomous dialogue. For example, even when we look at the familiarity within the armed forces in our continent and the international forces, ideologically, it's aligned with the United States strategy. Not just because they ask for support, but also there are dimensions that go much further than that. When we look at all the people, those who are in resistance, etc. So it's quite concerning that we don't have a clear vision in terms of where this is happening and all the links with the United States, so that we can question it and debate it. And I think that, for example, in Colombia, they were able to penetrate when they were talking about the war against junks in our region. It was completely militarized, and there were a lot of conflicts creating war within our continent. And I'm in complete agreement with what Carmen said. This whole idea of conflict amongst the people, for example, between Colombia and Venezuela, even up to recently, it's a real example. And it's very important where there's a change, a political change, where they change the strategy, where they have a diverse strategy, where all of these elements, social, economic, it comes back to the people. And all of that is important. And we also spoke about the combined armies, etc. And I think that all of that is part of the same thing. It's an attempt to observe, to ensure that they are in strategic places, and to protect and guarantee their force amongst the Latin American forces and ensure the resources that they want. And of course, it's linked to exploitation done by multinationals, etc. So when we look at the energy transformation, production, of course, there's a lot of exploitation that's happening within. Excellent, Chris. Thank you so very much. So I think that the response is way more complex than than what we started off with, but of course that is the idea. And of course we are coming a lot closer to this. Why is it important to try to renew what we have and not just look at this character of imperialism? we also need to talk about our project. And when we look at the historic processes that we have, all of these historic moments in the 20th century and even up to today, we need to maintain all of these Bolivarian flags on independence. And as Carlos and Carmen said, we need to be a large movement where we control our narrative and we continue our research and we talk about our emancipatory processes, looking at the Simon Bolivar Institute, ensuring that this name is always taken forward with all of the organizations such as the Tricontinental Institute, International People's Assembly, so that we can all be together in order to strengthen our tools in the struggle, as we said in the beginning. As we've outlined this campaign, nobody won thus far. We continue in this debate. So come on, put on your gloves so that we can go in the ring against imperialism, because maybe it will be our grandchildren who will actually manage this dream of the great liberator. So right now, we are on this, and thank you so much to Carlos, to Carmen, to Christian. Thank you to everyone who would have helped prepare. And in addition to the people who are here live, we also have those who are in Zoom, our comrades from all the various countries, to speak about the great ideas of the liberator and also to discuss them from our perspective of these 200 years of this Monroe Doctrine. And as we go day to day, the vulgarity of the capitalist system, which continues trying to take advantage of our territories, which would have led to the great mobilizations in Jujuy in Argentina against the governor. And of course, they're trying to take advantage of all of the natural resources in our continent. And so that's where we are. And thank you so much to everyone for coming out today. Thank you to the interpreters who were here today. And I personally speak a horrible English. Everyone calls me Sofia Vergara. So thank you so much to the interpreters. And thank you to Caio and Flor for the transmission. So follow us on the YouTube channels, and I will see you next Thursday at the same time on the same channel, so that we can look at the emancipatory thoughts. So we're going to continue working on the ideological project. So we will not stay any longer. Thank you so very much. This is the end of this round. See you next Thursday. Thank you to everyone. And see you next Thursday.